Indeed. Yep. My favorite lady. Okay, second favorite. Third, fourth, daughters, sixth, seventh, eighth. The dogs, okay, 12th maybe. Okay, I just see where this is going. So yes. So yes, it is true. We are coming to the end. So we got today and Thursday that I'm gonna be working on chapter 11. Tuesday, so next Thursday is going to be our last lecture exam. So that means next Tuesday is our last lecture. And basically where we are this Thursday, that's the line for 11. And then Tuesday is going to be focused on the cherry pick parts of spinal cord and central nervous system pieces that I want to make sure you have in your bag of tricks for AMP2. That's the cherry pick part. Yep. So so let's go ahead and make as much progress on 11 as possible. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of overlap in 11 that overlaps with 10 because of the action potential piece of it. I plan on skipping over that part because we've already discussed that in detail, which is the idea. It usually goes in either 10 or it goes in 11. And so I chose to put it in 10. Okay, so let's take a look at, we're talking now about the different cell types, right? We talked a little bit about the neurons, the neuroglia. We talked kind of about the pieces of the neuron itself. And so this is kind of like the neuron. So you can see clearly you've got the dendrites that are coming into the cell body, which is this piece right here. The Nissl bodies are these large guys right here. So this is kind of like pieces or collections of rough ER, which is rough because you are basically making proteins. So that's kind of what you're doing, or in this case, making it's the same basic process. And so you're screening it. And of course, then this big guy right here you've got is the axon. And so that's kind of like an appendage that comes out of it that's designed to sort of hold the outgoing message after the neuron body actually processes everything. And then, of course, you basically terminate in all these like little feet, these presynaptic terminals, which actually some books will refer to them as telodendria. And so these are each one of those like little feet that basically has touch to a muscle fiber, right? That's what we saw in the last chapter. Now, the other thing we want to take a look at is the sheathing around the axon. So notice these purple wraps around the axon itself. In a peripheral nerve cell, this is actually wrapped by a very specific glial cell called the Schwann cell. So this is what it does. It wraps its membrane around the axon, kind of like insulation, like wire insulation. But you can't have a continuous wrap. So you have these like little pockets where you have a little exposed axon. Those are the nodes of Ranvier. Those become very important when it comes to propagation of the action potential, which we'll take a look at. Now, in the central nervous system, the cells that do the sheathing is not the Schwann cells, it's the oligodendrocytes, right? So those are the ones that do the sheathing there. And so those are specifically in the central nervous system. So basically, when you take a look at a neuron, basically it's a normal cell, right? So you have basically axoplasm, which is the cytoplasm of the axon. That's basically what that is. And in it, you have cytoskeletal proteins, mitochondria, synaptic vesicles. So these basically are long microtubule filaments. And essentially what you have are these motor proteins that are moving your vesicles down these microtubule tracts toward the axon terminus. And so when you're going toward the terminals, it's what we refer to as anterograde movement. And this is important. A lot of people don't realize this, right? But there are cytoskeletal fibers in the axon, and you're just basically kind of trucking those vesicles, oftentimes full of neurotransmitter, down the axon so that they can be stored at the axon terminal where they wait for their signal to release. All right, so a lot of times that connection is missed when students are like, they'll remember the axon vesicles, but they'll like, wait a minute, where do these things come from? Well, they're coming from the cell body. The cell body is just making these just like anything else. If you remember from general bio, the secretory pathway, right? So you kind of pack these molecules into a vesicle, which is like a little membrane bubble, and you transport them. Normally during secretion, you just release them to the outside of the cell. In this case, you hang on to them and you just sort of move them down the axon to be stored at the axon terminus. Now, when you're moving the opposite direction, because you do have two-way traffic going on here. If you're moving toward the cell body, it's what's called retrograde, right? So for instance, anything that's damaged in the axon terminus that needs to be moved back to the cell body for repair or whatever, that's basically going retrograde. So what you do is you have a very busy thoroughfare in the axon of stuff going out to the axon terminus and stuff coming back in. So you're going back and forth. It's kind of like looking at a nice shot of 25, I-25, right? So when it's not congested. So you've got to have people kind of going north, you have people coming south, and they're basically just moving back and forth. That's exactly what it looks like inside the axon itself. So what kinds of neurons are there? Well, you can classify them in a couple of ways. Number one is you can classify them functionally, or you can classify them structurally. You see both conventions. If you want to do a functional classification, this is where you're breaking it into what they do. For instance, you can break them into either sensory or afferent in nature. That is to say, they're arriving, right? So these are action potentials coming toward the central nervous system, or motor, efferent, right? These are the exiting ones. And we saw that before with the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So these are going away from the central nervous system, carrying your terminal instructions out to your target. And then, of course, you have interneurons, which oftentimes are relay neurons. So these are relay neurons, which basically will take a message from one neuron and hand it off to another. All right, that's basically what they do. And they tend to be fairly short. So they're not very, very big ones. Probably what you see more often, and what you hear more often in lingo, is the structural classification. So it's based on what's attached to the cell body. For instance, if you have multiple projections attached to the cell body, you're referred to as a multipolar neuron. And this is basically like if you've got a bunch like dendrites and axons, all sorts of stuff coming off of you, you're multipolar. If you only have two connections to your cell body, you're bipolar. So you have two different regions. Typically, it's a sensory input kind of a thing. You see these a lot in your eye. So your retina, the cones and the rods of your retinal tissue are bipolar in nature. Then you have what's called pseudo or unipolar, which looks kind of like it's unipolar, but it's actually not. And so what it has is basically two branches, but one of them is kind of a dendrite-like sensory receptor that sort of branches off and sort of like what looks like a freeway off-ramp. I'll show you pictures of these. Probably be a little bit more sensible when you see pictures. And then of course you have anaxonic, which means no axon in these particular. So there's just a big ball of dendrites, essentially. So it's like a super multipolar in nature. So these are all various ways that you can structurally classify them. You oftentimes will see them that way. So the multipolar neuron, you can see you got lots of different poles here in terms of your dendrites. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different poles coming into the neuron. That's the dendrites, sending information to the cell body. And of course you have one major pole, the axon, that's leaving the cell body. But basically this is referred to as multipolar because you got a lot of stuff attached to it. Now the bipolar one is basically where you have two different pieces. So oftentimes what'll happen is you have some sort of a dendrite, oftentimes picking up sensory information like you have in your retina, and then it'll just relay that to just one single axon. So you got one dendrite, one axon. That's it. Very simple. you only have two different connections there. So that would be a bipolar. And so you see that actually in the retinal tissue. The pseudo-unipolar, this one looks unipolar. So if we take a look at the actual connection to the cell body, it looks like there's only one thing coming off of it. So that we say it's unipolar, but in reality, it's an off-ramp that's actually part of a larger situation. So you have kind of this dendrite dovetailing to axon kind of a situation where you have kind of like an off-ramp there. So it's technically not unipolar, right? So it's actually a type of bipolar. It's just that instead of directly connecting to the cell body, they're connecting to this sort of little ancillary sort of mini off-ramp axon. But it's still technically in spirit considered a type of bipolar. That's why we call it pseudo or false. Now the anaxonic is basically just the Medusa's head of just a bunch of dendrites. This is oftentimes what you see in your central nervous system, right? Because think about it. The only reason why you have an axon is if you have to send a message somewhere. The dendrites that, I mean, the axons that are, the neurons that are in your brain aren't sending stuff long distances. They're just communicating with their next door neighbor. So as a result, they tend to be these anaxonic neurons because they're just coordinating with adjacent neurons. They're not sending messages hither and yon. Okay. So those are structurally what you have. And when we take a look at the glial cells, these basically are all support cells. The astrocytes are at the top. So when you take a look at your neuron, here's your astrocyte right there. You can see the astrocyte will actually form a connection to the actual cell body of the neuron, and then it'll wrap itself around the capillary structure that's actually coming in and feeding blood to the nervous tissue. So what is it doing? So what it's basically doing is it's forming what we refer to as the blood-brain barrier. So pretty much everything that the neuron receives in terms of its nutrients and the things that it needs, oxygen, things of this nature, it's all coming through the astrocytes. So this is basically kind of screening the nutrients for the neurons. Anything in the blood that's destined for the neuron goes through the astrocytes first. Okay, so this is like an ultra VIP. This neuron doesn't talk to you, you talk to the neuron's people. And the chief of staff of its people is the astrocyte, right? So much so that the neuron is actually fed information from the astrocyte. So if you need nutrients from the blood, guess what? It goes through the astrocyte first. The astrocyte takes up those nutrients directly from the capillary. Those nutrients will go into the astrocyte, and the astrocyte will then shuttle that and give that to the neuron. Same thing is true for waste. Any waste the neuron is producing will go into the astrocyte. The astrocyte will dump that into the bloodstream for elimination. So whereas most cells are in contact with the blood in the vasculature, the neurons are not. They all go through the astrocytes. So you can think of the astrocytes as sort of like the ultimate nurse cell. This is basically nannying you. It's basically spoon feeding you pureed bananas, right? So you can think of the neuron as basically needing to be spoon fed its nutrition. Why? Because its sole complete focus is neurotransmission. So it doesn't even give any space at all for normal cell functions like eating and feeding itself and things like that. It basically says, listen, astrocyte, why don't you make my baby food for me? And I'm just going to sit here and think. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to think. Why don't you feed me? Right? So you do all that. So that's basically how specialized the neurons are. So they have, and this is kind of the queen mother, if you will, of the glial cells. There's others, however. There's also the ependymal cells. Typically, the ependymal cells that line the ventricles, which many of you guys saw in the sheep brain. And they form this liner of the ventricles forms a specific and a very important structure called the choroid plexus. And this basically is the generator of cerebral spinal fluid. So this will actually make cerebral spinal fluid. So what it does is the ependymal cells will basically secrete the cerebral spinal fluid. So the plasma actually that comes out of these cells basically turns into cerebral spinal fluid, and then it gets circulated throughout the ventricles. So the fluid that's in the ventricles, and the laterals, the third, and the fourth, is all coming from these ependymal cells by way of the choroid plexus. So the choroid plexus is this sort of ependymal structure where you're secreting the cerebral spinal fluid, and then it bathes your neural tissue in these open cavities and circulates throughout your central nervous system. So that's important, right? Because your body fluids are all descendants of plasma, including your cerebral spinal fluid. Another member of the glial pantheon, right, is the microglia. So these guys basically are macrophages, which means they're immune in response. So if there's any kind of an invader or anything of that nature, then the microglia will go after it and will kill it. These guys are phagocytic, so they'll basically kill bad guys. Why is that important? Because we already said that your nervous system, that is most of your neurons, are not in direct access to your blood circulation, which also means they're not in direct access to your normal immune cells. So the normal immune cells that are circulating in your blood are not going to have access to your neurons. So what happens then if you get a bacterial infection in the neurons, like meningitis, for instance, which is an inflammation or an infection of the meninges, right, which is the dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid mater. Well, you've got a garrison of troops, right? The microglia will basically go on the attack. They'll attack it, and then they will devour the bacteria, right? So this is kind of like your hired bodyguard. If you're a Roman emperor, then the neurons would be the emperor himself. The microglia would be like the Praetorian Guard, right? They were sort of a special force of guards that basically their job was to protect the emperor, right? And half the time they killed him, but that was their job to protect them. Now that brings us to oligodendrocytes, which basically has a similar function to Schwann cells, only this is now in the central nervous system, but they're doing the same thing. So here you can see your oligodendrocyte cell, and you can see how it basically has these sort of extensions of its plasma membrane, and it's wrapping it around these axons that you have in the central nervous system, sheathing them. Why? So that you can get better, more direct transmission across distance. Now, not all of your neurons are going to be short distance communicators. There are some that require long distance. As a matter of fact, when you have a clustering of these, it creates white matter. Right? The reason why it's white is because of these sheath-like wrappings of cell membrane from the oligodendrocytes. That wrapping of your lipid membrane is lipid, which is white. So when you wrap that around the axons, it creates a whitish look to it. So those the white matter, like for instance, the arbor vitae in the cerebellum, which many of you saw in the sheep brain, is a perfect example of areas or tracts where you have lots of these sort of axonal pathways where you have a congestion of axons. The gray matter, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's a clustering of cell bodies, right? We already looked at that. We had a similar definition for ganglia, right? So ganglia we defined as a clustering of cell bodies, but in the central nervous system, that creates gray matter. Okay, so it's gray because you don't have any axonal sheathing there. So there's no light coloredness there. Of course, in the peripheral nervous system, now we're moving outside the brain and spinal cord. We have a similar sort of a situation. Well, in this case, our wrapper is the Schwann cells. So the Schwann cells are functionally analogous to the oligodendrocytes. The only difference is Schwann cells are what you're going to see in your peripheral nerves, right? So your spinal nerves, like the median nerve and the ulnar nerve and things of that nature, those are all going to be wrapped with Schwann cells. And they're going to be, pretty much most of your peripheral nerves are going to be wrapped. Why? Because most of your peripheral nerves are crossing long distances of your body. So they have to have that sheathing and that wrapping, okay, so that you can get really good transfer. Now, there's another group of cells called satellite cells, which are just basically a grouping of cells or clustering cells that surround the cell body. Specifically in ganglia, like in parasympathetic or sympathetic ganglia. And these will kind of feed the ganglia cell bodies. So the ganglia, remember the cell bodies need food too. So the satellite cells are kind of like what the astrocytes are, only they're in the peripheral nervous system. So the way that the astrocytes wrap themselves around the cell bodies of the neurons in your central nervous system, in your brain, your spinal cord, feeding them and providing nutrients for them and support for them, the satellite cells are doing the same thing in the peripheral nervous system when you have these ganglionic clusters of cell bodies, right? Because these cell bodies also need nutrients. I mean, they're processing signals just like the cell bodies in the central nervous system. So these will allow you to have a little extra support for these ganglia. Because remember, these ganglia are basically the think tanks of your peripheral nervous system. These are major thinking stations. They're processing stations to basically coordinate responses throughout your body. Because you have a lot of stuff going on in your peripheral nervous system. Messages are flying everywhere. And so you want to make sure you coordinate all those responses. And that's exactly what these ganglia do. So they need a lot of nutrients and support for that purpose. So this is kind of like their entourage, if you will. Okay. Notice functionally they're similar. It's just a different type, a different cell that does it between central and peripheral nervous system. That make sense? Just look at the myelinated and unmyelinated axon. So basically when you're myelinated, all that really means is that you're going to be insulated and you're going to be basically wrapped around by this sheath of lipid membrane. And the sheath is basically what we refer to as myelin. So this is the wrappings of lipid membrane. Now, obviously, there are gaps in between coverings or sheathing, and those gaps are what's referred to as the nodes of Ranvier. And then, of course, these form the basis of white matter, so just like we saw on the last one. So now, unmyelinated axons typically will not be wrapped around the axon. And so, along with the cell bodies, you will oftentimes find unmyelinated axons in the gray matter as well, right? So you don't have a congestion of this wrapping, this myelin sheathing. And so this is part of your gray matter. It's kind of what it looks like. So the myelinated sheath, you can see it's basically your Schwann cell. So in this particular case, you can see here's the first cell here. So you can see how literally the cell just basically wrapped itself around this axonal sheath until it can't wrap anymore. And it creates essentially this nice tight wrapping, this insulation. Of course, you have cell number 1 over here. So you kind of have a little bit of a break there. So that's going to be your node where you have an exposed area of the axon, right? There's no sheathing there at the node. Unmyelinated axon, it's a little bit different, right? So it does kind of hang out with oligodendrocyte, but what it does, it kind of basically rests in like a little bit of channel. So in this particular case, what you've got are the individual axons themselves. The little circles you're seeing inside the axons are what's called neurofilaments. And these are basically the microtubules that we just talked about that are laid down inside the axon itself. That's what these are. So these axon then are just basically kind of like, they're just sort of sitting down into a oligodendrocyte and just kind of oozes around it a little bit. It's not unlike sitting in a really giant beanbag chair, right? And it just kind of oozes around you a little bit. You're not technically wrapped around with it. It just kind of melts around you a little bit. So you're not completely covered. Therefore, they don't really refer to you as a myelinated. Got a lot of axon exposed here. It's not covered. But it does give you a little bit of coverage, right, for where you are. It's just a little bit different.
The axon just in the center of that?
These little circles are the axons. This big guy right here is the nucleus of an oligodendrocyte.
What's inside that circle, the little nodes?
This?
Are those all axons?
These guys right here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have multiple axons that kind of sit down in the oligodendrocyte, and the oligodendrocyte just kind of rolls around it. Yep. Okay, so let's just do a really quick rundown of response to injury, right? So obviously it's a problem if you damage your nerves. It's not a good thing. anywhere close as forgiving as any of your rest of your tissues when it comes to injury and healing. But basically, it can either heal or it can be pretty much permanent. It all depends on what the nature of it is. So for instance, when you take a look at sort of degeneration, so this is kind of like within your like 3 to 5 days or so. The axon that's distal or furthest away from the cut, like if you cut into a particular axon, it's going to sort of desegregate into segments, and that's because it's being starved, basically. So it's been cut off from its nutrient supply, and then it's going to die, right? So that's the first thing that's going to happen. That distal portion is going to die. And then the Schwann cells will begin to degenerate, right? So that's the next step. So your covering will start to degenerate. And then your macrophages will come in and they'll start to phagocyze myelin. These guys are basically cleaning up. That's what the macrophages are doing. Typical wound healing, right? Damaged tissue, you got shards of debris all over the place. The macrophages come in and their job is to clean up the mess, right? That's kind of what's happening here. Nothing really all that dramatically different at this particular point from just any other injury where you damage the tissue dies, the macrophages come in and start cleaning it all up. And so then what happens is now your response to restore comes in with your next response from the Schwann cells, which is they begin to enlarge, so they're responding now, and they divide a little bit. So you're increasing this. And so what they do is they kind of form a little bit of a column where the axon used to be. And the idea is if you can get the axon to come into contact with the cell column, it's more likely going to reestablish its contact. So the Schwann cell basically, should go next door and be like, be quiet. You're being recorded. It's like, you can probably hear him better than me actually on the recording. But right, so the idea is the Schwann cell creates like a tunnel in hopes that the axon can regenerate into it. And the idea is if you're able to get it to come into contact with that Schwann cell tunnel, then it might be able to reestablish contact with your ultimate nerve end. Okay, so that's kind of a regeneration thing. CNS, however, that's a peripheral nervous thing, right? So the CNS is a little bit different because oligodendrocytes like Schwann cells, they don't do that whole column thing. So if you damage your brain tissue, you're basically damaged your brain tissue. There's not a lot of, you're not going back from that. So you're living with that is basically what's happening. And what's usually your response is your brain adapts to that and tries to rewire itself around it, right? So that's kind of what happens. So here's what we're looking at. So here's our normal side of injury. So you basically have a cut in your neuron. So if the ends are close together, then you'll be able to create this like little regeneration tunnel with your Schwann cells, and you'll be able to reconnect the actual neuron itself and restore it. However, if the ends are too far apart, then what's going to happen is you're going to lose this piece and it's going to kind of reform a new end. So this is basically you've lost this connection to this muscle. And so this is going to start to atrophy. So your muscle is no longer going to get response from the nervous system. And then it's just going to atrophy and wither because it's not getting any kind of feedback saying, oh, you need to increase your number of muscle fibers to max load. Right? It's going to be like, oh, there's no load here anymore. Okay. So I can go ahead and dial it all back to pretty much minimal body mass. Okay, good. Yeah, so somebody who's paralyzed, basically what you have is a damage, usually of a spinal nerve or a central nerve, depends on what's going on, right? But essentially what's happening is you're failing to, the nature of the injury is creating an abrupt sever of that communication stream. So the communication that would normally go out through the spinal nerves to the muscle to communicate to it has been severed. So in paralysis, that severing is actually in the central nervous system usually. And so you're cutting off the signal to not just a muscle, but to whatever muscles that particular area feeds, including like your whole lower body. And so the muscles don't get routine stimulation for contraction, and therefore they get nothing. So they start to atrophy down. This is one of the reasons why you get muscular atrophy in paralytics. So then we have gray matter, right, which is basically a combination of unmyelinated axons, cell bodies with their dendrites and things of that nature. And so oftentimes we'll see this in the cortex, the cerebral cortex. There's a lot of gray matter out there, a lot of processing. So this is basically stimulus processing. White matter then is going to be mostly myelinated axons. So you have propagation of a signal going somewhere. So this is basically what's causing it to be white. Now, in the central nervous system, there's a little bit of nomenclature here. We've kind of already met it. But there's a different set of terms, and you probably picked this up already, right? So oftentimes in the central versus the peripheral nervous system, we have parallel terms, but they're different names, depending on whether you're in the central or the nervous system or peripheral nervous system. Remember, in the peripheral nervous system, we had a cluster of cell bodies, which we called a ganglion, right? So that same thing, exactly the same thing in the central nervous system, in the brain is what we refer to as a nuclei. So a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is nuclei, not ganglia. So nuclei and ganglia are the same thing. It's just that ganglia are in the peripheral nervous system and nuclei are in the brain. Now, bundles of myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system were called what? We call them nerves, right? But in this case, they're nerve tracts. So we differentiate the difference between nerves and nerve tracts. So we can determine whether or not we're in the central versus the peripheral nervous system. And this right here, we already covered on the first slide, right? So that's just basically a recapitulation of that previous slide that we already had, right? So nuclei and ganglia are the same structure. One is in the central, one is in the peripheral. Nerve tracts are the same as nerves. It's just that one is in the central and one is in the peripheral, okay? Just like oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are essentially the same function. One is in the central, one is in the peripheral. Satellite cells are similar to astrocytes. One is in the central, one is in the peripheral. So you'll notice that you have a lot of parallels between central and peripheral, but their names are different. You're not actually learning two different things. Learning the same thing by two different names. Okay, so this is the section that's going to go move pretty quickly because we already did a lot of the heavy intro work on this one, right? So we already know about action potentials because we unpacked this one in the neuromuscular junction in the previous chapter. And we already know the membrane potential because we talked about this one a couple of times, right? That basically the charge or the voltage across the membrane that's associated with pumping the sodium, in this particular case, the potassium, and creating a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other. We also know that the one who's creating these concentration gradients, and in this particular case, that's also creating these membrane potential, is our sodium potassium pump, right? So they're the ones who are creating this disparity of charge across an insulator, which is essentially creating our membrane potential. And so we have already been introduced to this. We already know also that the sodium potassium pump is driven by ATP, that it exchanges 3 sodiums for every 2 potassiums, which is the reason why we get an accumulation of +1 positive charge for every pump on the outside versus on the inside, which is the reason why we have a relative positive charge on the outside and a relative negative charge on the inside to give us our membrane potential, right? So that is charge disparity separated by an insulator is going to give us our membrane potential. There's nothing new there, right? We already talked about all that in the previous chapter. We also talked about leak channels, right? So leak channels play an important role in maintaining membrane potential, because remember, before in the previous chapter, we said that it is important to not overpolarize, because otherwise you're going to shock yourself at a physiological level. So in order to maintain that membrane potential, but not to overpolarize, you have leak channels that allow you to kind of create this sort of dynamic stability, right? So you have these leak channels that are allowing the charge to sort of recalibrate in conjunction with the sodium potassium pumps, which are trying to set the concentration gradient. The two of those together allows you to sort of create this sort of maintained membrane potential, which roughly is around -70 millivolts. for your average skeletal muscle. Okay. We also last chapter talked about channelology, didn't we? We talked about how channels are controlled. We talked about osmotic control. We talked about ligand gated control, this one, right? Basically where a particular chemical signal will open up a channel, an ion channel, in this case, sodium, right? And of course, in this particular case, our ligand of choice is acetylcholine because that was the one that was involved in the neuromuscular junction signaling, right? And then, of course, we talked about the voltage gated channels, right? So basically these guys will open or close their gates by the change in membrane potential, which we can oftentimes get kicked off by allowing an inrush of sodium, right? Which causes a depolarization event, and that's a change in membrane potential. And then a couple of others. So we talked about mechanical gating. So that's mechanical stimulation. So touch receptors are mechanically gated. We talked about the specific one in the inner ear, right? So where you basically use a distortable membrane that opens up physically the actual gate itself. But touch receptors are a type of mechanical gating, so you can distort them, right? Temperature receptors, we already know about those. Those are heat and cold, or hot and cold receptors that you see in your skin as well. So those are also different types of receptors. So you just basically have a gated system that's responsive to that particular change. So when you take a look then at your resting membrane potential, the important thing is to remember is that the membrane of an axon is polarized, partially positive on the outside, partially negative on the inside, to the activity of the sodium potassium pump. And so ultimately this resting membrane potential will range between -70 and -90 millivolts, depending on where you are. And so this resting membrane potential, or RMP, is what we have at rest. This is what the leak channels are maintaining along with the sodium potassium pump to maintain equilibrium. And so we already talked a little bit about the changes in permeability, right? That is to basically say how receptive are you to allowing the influx of sodium, right? So that's a change in permeability. And so a lot of this is basically largely recapitulation from what we mentioned before, right? So this is basically the mechanism of maintaining your RMP, your resting membrane potential, right? We kind of unpacked this one pretty good, I think, in the last chapter, where we went and looked at the individual potassium gates, the leak gates, right? The sodium leak channels and the potassium leak channels right next to the gated channels. So there's a combination of gated channels for both sodium and potassium, where the leak channels are designed to sort of balance, create this sort of resting membrane potential to prevent hyperpolarization. So I think we kind of unpacked that, I think, fairly well. Unless you guys have any questions, I'm going to keep moving. Okay. So for your resting membrane potential, this is kind of a nice image to just add to what you already have in the last chapter, mostly because it's really kind of Australia, because it also shows you the role of other things that we may not necessarily think about, like for instance, proteins. Like some proteins are negatively charged, so they will add to the negative environment of the inside. And then of course you have the basic maintenance of your leak channels that will basically maintain this pathway. This is essentially the exact same image from last chapter. Basically you have your leak channels, which are allowing sodiums to leak in, potassiums also to leak in response to whatever their control is, right? The nice thing about leak channels is leak channels are part of the osmotic control group of channels, right? They're simply just going through in response to both their chemical gradient, that's their concentration gradient, and their charge gradient, right? So potassium says, a little too positive out here, I'm going to go inside. And so there it goes, okay? And so it's whatever these tensions are on either side, that's what it's responding to, and it's free to just move through there, right? So in response to this and the sodium potassium pump, which you can see here, is always actively at work, then the leak channels are buffering constantly the activities of the sodium potassium pump. So this is polarizing. And this is basically reducing hyperpolarization. Making sure you keep that nice, stable resting membrane potential. That's what these leak channels are doing. This is, by the way, just the blab slide. That's it. So if you like a list of just sequentially going through that piece, feel free to study this. Okay. Like I said, remember when we went over this physiology last chapter? I said it will be covered on the last exam, but it's going to come back on the next. So just because I say we covered this well in the last exam, we're moving through it, don't mistake that for meaning that it's not going to be on the exam, right? Because this is critical physiology, hence the reason why it's produced in 2 major chapters, right? It's underscoring the importance of this physiological process. It just happens to be that we don't necessarily have to cover it twice, just sort of point it out and sort of alter it and sort of add a few new touches to it. Haley. Different. So ATP pretty much energizes anything you do in your cell. In this particular case, ATP is actually the energy source for the sodium potassium pump to move sodium and potassium uphill against its concentration gradients. So that's its power there. What you're talking about is something completely different. So the myosin heads is only associated with sliding filament theory, right? So that's basically just what's happening in the myofilaments, and that's a completely different function and activity for ATP. Make sense? Okay, so now that we've got resting membrane potential, let's mess with it, shall we? Because that's the fun part. Depolarization, right? So basically what depolarization is the inrush of sodium. This is caused by the inrush of sodium. And so as it rushes in, what's going to happen is the inside is going to become more positive. And so your charge is going to flip, or it's going to become more positive. It's not going to actually become positive inside. That was just for illustration's purposes to make it clear. Reality, what it does, it just becomes less negative is what it does actually. So it goes from like minus 70, which is your resting membrane potential, down to minus 55, which is your depolarized potential. Notice what you don't want to do is you don't want the system to come to zero, right? So because what happens is it's going to be difficult to repolarize that. It's going to be a lot to repolarize that. So you just want enough to trip the voltage gates. That's all you want. So essentially, if you just give it enough of a depolarization to trip those voltage gates, that's all you want. Everything else is just unnecessary work. Your sodium potassium pump is just going to work twice as hard to restore it. So if you go all the way down to zero instead of minus 55, or all the way up to zero, rather, I should say, instead of minus 55, then that just means you're going to have to reload 55 millivolts worth of transport that you don't necessarily need, because you can get the job done by just hanging out at minus 55, right? So it's unnecessary. So that's so that's kind of an important thing, right? These oscillations typically are not absolute. They're just basically, you're just kind of toggling back and forth. You're kind of going from a resting state to like just a little bit, and then just a little bit over here. You're not going all the way to zero, right? Because if you go all the way to zero, that basically usually means you got a dead system. And not only that, but when you reset the system, you got to start all the way from zero, which means you're working too hard for what you're doing, okay? So what causes depolarization? Simple, sodium ions, that's what it is. Basically the inrush of sodium ions. So your gated sodium channels open up, your sodium basically rushes into the cell, and then essentially that causes the flip to positive charge, or to a more positive membrane potential. So depolarization can also be caused by calcium, right? That's also a positive charge. Pretty much any positive charge that rushes in can cause depolarization, right? So it's not necessarily just the thing of sodium. Now, where do we see this, the depolarization associated with calcium? We see this in cardiac muscle cell. So you'll probably talk more about this in the cardiovascular section in AMP2, right? Because what you usually do in AMP2 is we compare the difference between skeletal muscle and the skeletal muscle dynamics and cardiac muscle. And part of that discussion is the calcium effect, okay? So generally speaking, this will be enough to depolarize that membrane. And of course, if you depolarize the membrane, then that means you're going to be tripping those voltage gated sodium channels. And then ultimately, once those voltage gated sodium channels close, then you can stabilize that with calcium. And so you can use calcium to your advantage, right? Because it's also a positive ion, just like potassium. So when you're looking at cardiac muscle cells, you actually have a couple of players here. Sodium is the big one. Potassium is kind of a counterbalance, right? And of course, you have calcium that's also in there, which can also be useful. Calcium, by the way, can also regulate your neurotransmitter. Remember, this is the signal for release. We learned about this in the last chapter. This is the signal for release into the presynaptic cleft, right? That's the signal for those vesicles to fuse and to dump acetylcholine into the cleft. That signal is calcium. So calcium has also a depolarization, although it's not a dominant depolarization role. Potassium ions, because of its high concentration inside the cell, usually it'll want to diffuse outside of the cell. But you can mess with this really easily, right? Especially by repelling it with positive charge. And so ultimately what's going to happen is, because you've got the concentration, that is the potassium high on the inside, versus outside, then by concentration gradient, it's naturally going to want to flow from the inside to the outside, right? But then all of a sudden, here comes sodium. All the sodium comes in and you've dumped all this positive charge. What is that going to do with potassium? It already wants to go out, right? Because of the concentration gradient. But now what you've got is this ton of charge coming in that's the same as potassium. Like charges do what? They repel, right? So now potassium says, wait a minute, not only does my concentration gradient want me to go out, but now I've got all these positive sodiums in here. So that really wants me to go out. So now you got two different motivations for potassium to go out once you end rush. Again, this basically illustrates potassium as the counterbalance. So as sodium rushes in, the reason why you don't go to zero is because potassium swings out to temper that influx, right? So you don't go all the way to zero, because it's like that's the counterbalance. Potassium is your counterbalance. Okay. So once you depolarize, basically, you have a depolarization. No, this is wrong. This should be hyper. So you're getting more negative. Meaning that sodium builds up more on the outside, making it more positive and more negative. So you're steepening this grade, right? So your resting membrane potential goes from -70 to -90. That basically means you're making it worse. There's two different ways to hyperpolarize, right? With your potassium is how you normally do it. So generally speaking, your gated potassium channels are open up. Your potassium diffuses out of the cell down its concentration gradient. And that basically makes the inside become more negative. Oh, it's written right there. sorry. Right, so basically if you have your potassium channels open and you're moving outward, that's going to be positive charge that goes out, which is going to steepen that divide. Now, of course, this basically means that your sodium situation has to be stopped, right? That dynamic flux has to be stopped, right? So what happens is you start to get this sort of massive buildup of potassium, double positive charge moving toward the outside, which accumulates positive charge on the outside, and then that creates a hyperpolarization. The other possibility is chloride ions, where chloride ions basically have a negative charge. And so in this particular case, your chloride ions, which is higher on the outside, wants to naturally go inside. So if you have a ligand-gated chloride ion channel, then it's going to go into the cell, making the cell more negative, thereby hyperpolarizing it, right? So if your normal sodium concentration is the same outside, and you get an influx of chloride ions, it's going to accumulate negative charge on the inside, making it look more negative on the inside. That's the hyperpolarization piece of it. You're making it look more extreme, more positive on the outside, more negative on the inside. This, by the way, is a strategy that we see actually for some inhibitory neurotransmitters. That's the way they'll do it. So hyperpolarization is kind of like the opposite of depolarization. So it creates a level of insensitivity in terms of action potential response. Okay. And so this is kind of like a mechanism for some neurotransmitters are excitatory or activating, and others are inhibitory. The inhibitory can inhibit by hyperpolarizing, right? Basically making you less prone to depolarizing. So you're going the opposite direction of depolarizing. Depolarizing is activating, hyperpolarizing is deactivating. That makes sense? So this is kind of what it looks like. So here is, now notice you're not looking at muscle tension. This is the most common mistake that students make. Notice here what you're looking at now is volts, millivolts in particular, right? So here's your resting membrane potential at -70. Then what's going to happen is you're at resting, and then you get a depolarization event right here, right? And then ultimately you're going to get a repolarization. Notice you kind of dip down below. This down here would represent a hyperpolarization. So you're getting more negative in this case. So you're going down to -90. And then you kind of get sort of yourself calibrated back up to resting membrane potential. So both of these, this is your depolarization curve, and this would be what your hyperpolarization curve looks like. So you're moving further away from zero, which is depolarization is moving towards zero. So you're getting more positive with depolarization, and hyperpolarization, you're getting more negative, right? Your charge separation is getting steeper, which, if you think about it, is dangerous, right? Because if that gets too steep, then you're going to shock yourself. Eventually, technically speaking, if that charge separation gets too great, then it's going to arc, and you're going to shock yourself at a physiological level. So here's your communication. Here you can see basically you've got your resting membrane potential set up by your axon. So your axon essentially is riddled with tons of these leak channels. So you can see you got sodium leak channels, you got potassium leak channels. And this is all basically along your axon. This is also with you'll also have your voltage gated channels in here as well, right? So you have a combination of both of these things. So first of all, you generate your action potential up here in what's called the axon hillock. Then it's going to propagate that message all the way down the axon until it gets to your terminus, which then will release the calcium ions, which will trigger the release of those synaptic vesicles. All right, and then that's where last chapter picks up, essentially. So let's take a look at it. How do you get this whole thing started? Well, basically, the way to get this thing started is you have to reach threshold. And ultimately, just like we had before, a threshold, we have a threshold here. If you're sub-threshold, you get nothing. If you're super threshold, you get everything. It's an all or nothing thing. And so that's an important thing to always remember. So what we have, however, is a type of potential that we call graded potential. Now, where does this graded potential come from? First of all, this graded potential generally is sub-threshold. So you're kind of building up. So this is a subthreshold buildup before an action potential firing. Which, like muscles, is all or nothing. So what happens is you have a relatively small change in your membrane potential. It's fairly local. Sometimes you'll refer to this as a local potential as well. And what is that caused by? It's caused by the influx of sodium ions, right? So basically, when your ligands bind to your receptors, it's going to change the charge. Why? Because of your sodium ion influx. So when your sodium ions are influxing into the channel itself, that charge is creating a graded potential. And eventually it's going to increase and increase and increase until it's going to be enough to flip the charge on the membrane itself. Okay. So this is a type of graded potential. It's changing, but it's not up to threshold. It's sub-threshold in this particular case. So mechanical stimulation, remember we got this from channelology, like for instance, in the inner ear. Temperature changes. Notice this is your temperature sensors. We talked about this one. There are some random changes in permeability, but generally speaking, those are less a factor, right? Notice we just got done talking about these, didn't we? In channelology, we talked about ligand gates, voltage gates. Those are all the same thing, right? We talked about mechanical gates. We talked about temperature gates, right? So we talked about all of those just a few slides ago. So all of those, when they're opening up, they're creating a little inflow of positive charge, and that's creating a graded potential. Now, depending on what it is and the direction it's going, it can either hyperpolarize if it's steepening the gradient, or it can depolarize if it's shallowing the gradient. Ultimately, then, what can happen is you can get a series of these little trickles of charge, if you will, that can sum up and ultimately reach threshold. At which point you basically throw open the floodgates and it's gangbusters at that point, right? So it's kind of like a breaking dam, right? So a breaking dam starts off with a little bit of a trickle, right? And then that trickle starts to add to other breaks or fractures in the dam. Then eventually those can all sum together, and then there goes the whole dam. Look out downstream, you're all drowning, right? That's basically how that works out, because you reach the threshold of structural integrity in this particular case for the dam. And the threshold for your potential is what you have to meet, right? So you need to meet that threshold in order to get an action potential. If you're sub-threshold, no action potential. If you reach the threshold, boom, you're off to the races, okay? So that's the key. The key is, how do you get an inrush of sodium in order to reach threshold? We got to make sure you have enough. And so that's basically what we have. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see you've got basically, you have a small volume of sodium coming in at number 1, right? So you have a slight depolarization, right? And 2 or 3, basically you have greater numbers coming in. So you have greater numbers, so it's coming in a little bit stronger. So now you can see you've got a little bit of a because of the in positive charge coming in, you got a little uptick in the membrane potential. And the second one, because it's a greater volume, you've got a bigger uptick and a bigger uptick in 3. So this is like your summation. You're getting bigger and bigger until 4 and 5. Basically, this is where you get that whole, like all of them get summed together. So you get kind of 4, which piggybacks onto 5, which then gets you to where you need to go, the full depolarization, right? So you can see that depending at your depolarization amount, this graded, that's why they call it graded, right? Is because it's like a modulator. It's like a dimmer switch. That is directly proportional to the amount of positive charge. Right? The more positive charge you have coming in, the stronger the response, the closer the threshold you get. You get a little bit more charge, you get a little closer. If you sum them, right, then you can basically just kind of leapfrog, right? one will get maybe partway there, but then if you piggyback off of that one, boom, you can basically jump off of that one and hit threshold and you're off to the races, right? So that's kind of how graded potential works. This is kind of like your blab slide or your list slide, your table slide for essentially that basic process, how you kind of summate and do that and the different ions involved. So let's take a look at action potentials. So this is basically your nervous impulse. So this is how you're sending out messages to the body. Of course, it is basically resting and relying on the major component, which is depolarization first, right? So that's your first piece of it. And then once you depolarize, you have to repolarize, which is basically resetting the system or resetting the membrane. Then you have what's called after potential, which is oftentimes a hyperpolarization situation. And then you have your total return. This is going to drive me nuts. I'm going to reach in there. Strangle the PowerPoint. Destroy iPad. Death to Apple. Right. Then you go back to your resting membrane potential. The important thing to remember is that this is all or nothing, right? You're either all in or you're all out. There is no in between. Now, the graded potential represents a subthreshold. By the way, subthreshold means you're all out, right? So it means a subthreshold kind of build up before you hit threshold. But when you're talking about action potential, there's no grading to it. It's either all on or it's all off, right? And so this is basically just kind of like the depolarization and sort of the blab side. So a lot of you guys kind of like these sorts of things because it sort of lists it out for you guys. This is purely just a study aid for you guys. That's the only reason why it's there. So it's kind of what it looks like. So let's take a look at it first. So here we are at our resting membrane potential down here. Let's see, we're at -70. And then what's going to happen is you notice we're going to start to get a little bit of an inrush. We're going to start to get this graded potential. So notice you see a subthreshold increase in your membrane potential. So now you're getting more and more positive, but you're subthreshold. So that is what we mean by graded potential. So you're on your way there, but you're not there yet. Okay, so you're subthreshold, so you don't have anything at this point. Then when you hit threshold, then it's gangbusters. Boom. Then you hit depolarization. All the gates open up. All the inrush comes in. You get this massive depolarization only down to a certain level. And then eventually what's going to happen is you're going to repolarize and you're going to reset the system. But guess what? When you repolarize, you actually hyperpolarize. That's your after potential, your hyperpolarized potential. And then eventually what's going to happen is you're going to bring this back to resting. Sound familiar? Yeah, we pretty much talked about that last chapter, didn't we? Right? So that's basically what you've got. So then when you take a look at it, and this is kind of like a nice, because they put the pictures with it, right? So at the resting membrane potential, you can see all your leak channels are basically maintaining your resting membrane potential, your subthreshold and your resting membrane potential. And then eventually what's going to happen is you're going to hit your stimulus. And so you can see you're going to get that local or graded potential. It's going to start to increase and increase and increase. You're going to get above threshold where you're going to depolarize. Now you can see you've got the inrush of sodiums coming in. That's your depolarization. And then once you meet your peak depolarization, you start to repolarize, which means you're closing all your gates and your potassium is sort of resetting itself. But then you continue to hyperpolarize. That's this number 4 piece of it. So notice your sodium channels are closed, but your potassium channels are basically still hyperpolarizing. So they're basically making the negative more negative and the positive more positive for a little bit until they close. And then notice now, they're just basically on maintenance. So now that's a recapitulation. So your after potential is this one right here. So now what happens is notice both your potassiums and your sodiums are closed, and now your pump restores this. So a normal oscillation is to go resting potential to graded potential, hitting threshold, depolarization, then repolarization, then hyperpolarization, and then the potassium gates close. Now everybody's closed, and it's just the pump that brings it back to resting membrane potential. Okay. So what about sensitivity? Well, this is where our refractory here. We talked a little bit about this, right? So when you take a look at this, you have 2 different what's called refractory periods. These are periods of insensitivity, regions or times of insensitivity to stimulus. So generally speaking, in the purple area where you're basically going from depolarization, and most of repolarization is what's called absolute refractory period. This basically means that you are insensitive to stimulus. So it doesn't matter if you get more stimulus coming in, you're not doing anything. You're resetting the mousetrap. That's basically what's happening. I was making the ground. Yeah, right. So you're basically resetting the mousetrap. You just sprung the mousetrap, right? Now what's happening is you're resetting the mousetrap. But when you first start off, right, you don't have a lot in there, right? So you're just beginning. So you're still insensitive. The mouse can dance all over the mousetrap and nothing's gonna happen to it because there's no energy left in it, right? So you haven't reset it yet. That's absolute refractory period. But there's a point in resetting the mousetrap, right, where you're basically pulling it and it's about halfway there. So you got a little bit of response to it, right? So if the mouse dances on it, you can let it go and it can kind of maybe anger it a little bit. But it's not a full response. That's relative refractory. So here you get partial response to stimulus. And then eventually what will happen is you finish resetting the system and then you're going to get your full. Notice the hyperpolarization piece is your relative. So in order to recover, you have to go through the entire threshold, depolarization, repolarization, absolute refractory, relative refractory, reset the system with your sodium potassium pump, and you're ready for another one. So you can see the absolute and relative refractory periods that we talked about in the muscle. It's the same thing. Now in cardiac muscle, it's a little bit different. The one thing we didn't talk about, however, in muscle was propagation. We did kind of a little bit, right? We did talk about continuous conduction, didn't we? We didn't talk about saltatory conduction. So this one's new. So what's continuous conduction? Well, it's easy. Remember when we did channelology and I drew out the membrane getting started with the ligand gated channel, and then from there it's just like dominoes tripping one after another, the voltage gates, and one segment of the membrane trip the next, or trip the next, or trip the next. That's called continuous conduction. Basically, where the action potential, the depolarization event of one segment of membrane will depolarize the next segment. And it just basically rolls from one membrane, piece of membrane to another, to another, to another. That's continuous conduction. And that happens in typically unmyelinated neurons. So usually you don't have to go very far, which is good because you're not going to get very far, right? So like your central nervous system neurons would have a lot of continuous conduction in them. Now, what about your peripheral, right? What if you're sending something from your brain to your foot? You got lots of distance to travel, right? So do you want to do the continuous conduction thing? Not really, right? Because basically continuous conduction, you're just sort of moving along, you're just kind of like moving around just a little bit like this, just one little segment at a time. That's the way you're moving, right? If I have to walk a long distance, that's not very efficient. It's okay if I'm just walking just next to you guys, right? But saltatory conduction is basically by moving in jumps. So this basically moves and jumps. So if I want to basically cover the exact same distance, I can move instead of like just a little bit at a time. I can move in jumps. I can go like this. There, already there, right? How much faster was that? A lot faster, right? So that's basically what saltatory conduction is like. So basically here is the continuous version. So you can see you have depolarization of a segment of membrane, which basically will create a graded potential, which will then ultimately reach threshold and depolarize the next segment of membrane. This guy then will essentially then go on repolarization mode, while this guy's graded potential will then depolarize the next adjacent piece, and then so forth and so forth and so forth. So you can kind of see this sort of rippling down the axon. It's very similar, by the way, to the mechanics of doing the wave at a stadium, right? When one section stands up, that triggers the next section to stand up. And so what you have is this kind of continuous wave going through the stadium. That's very much the way continuous propagation is like. And this is something you see over local distances. But what about saltatory? Well, saltatory is a little bit different, right? Because you still have the same kind of thing. But in this case, you're jumping from node to node. So when you jump from node to node, what's going to happen is here's your point of depolarization. And then what's going to happen is you're going to generate a local current, which is then going to cross beyond the insulated section. And it's not going to touch bases until it reaches the next node. Once it does that, then it's going to depolarize this node. And then this node will create a local current, which will then depolarize this one. And then this one will depolarize this one, and this one will depolarize this one. So instead of going little bit by little bit, you're jumping from node to node to node. So you're essentially jumping from one piece to the next to the next. So you move much, much faster, right? So you don't have to worry about all that stuff that's underneath the Schwann cells, underneath that myelin sheath, because you're going from node to node to node, okay? Like a game of neurological hopscotch, right? So you just basically jump from one square to the next, to the next, to the next. You're not doing a continuous sort of thing. This speeds up transmission by a lot, which is one of the reasons why in the peripheral nervous system, you see most of your nerves are myelinated, because most of them have to go over long distances to cross your entire body to innervate your body. The reason why those axons are myelinated, that's why you see most of your brain cells, a lot of them are unmyelinated, right? So those unmyelinated neurons you tend to see in the brain and less to a lesser extent in the spinal cord is because they're not interested in going across the body. They just need to communicate with their next door neighbor because they're thinking, they're going over data, information, sensory inputs that you guys have just received from the sensory, right? The afferent side of the nervous system, and it's processing all that information, trying to make some sense out of it. Okay, that's what's happening. The synapse pretty much is all review. Why? Because the neuromuscular junction is a synapse. How many times is that? Yeah, anyway, right? So the neuromuscular junction, so when we were learning neuromuscular junction, that basically is a synapse. And so we have our presynaptic and postsynaptic target. We had a chemical synapse, right? So acetylcholine. Now we can add a chemical or electrical synapse, right? Where you can actually use kind of electrical signal. So one of the things that's important with electrical synapses is they're connected by a gap junction. Remember we talked about gap junctions before? That's like that sieve-like connections of channels that connects two cells. We talked about the cardiac muscle cell. Typically speaking, these are formed by proteins called connexons. And this is mostly associated with cardiac muscle cell, okay? So that's kind of what it looks like. This is actually what a connexon looks like. This is a gap junction. So you can see basically, you just basically move these electrical signals, these positive charges, right through those gap junctions. So you can see how you immediately, as soon as you get an electrical potential, an action potential, it immediately right through one cell to the next. So it's immediate communication. This is how you can coordinate your cardiac muscle cells. Okay, so what we'll do next time is we will do a very quick review of the chemical synapses, which is essentially a recapitulation of the neuromuscular junction. So this section, expect to go quickly because we've already laid down a lot of the groundwork for this one. This is just, I'm just gonna look for modifications and little additions to this one, okay? So there is that. So we'll do that on Thursday. Then of course, like I said, Thursday is going to be it for chapter 11. That line will be done. Wherever we are at the end of Thursday is where we are at the end of Thursday for 11. And the next Tuesday is going to be the cherry pick. It's going to be like a 1 hour, 15-minute sort of special lecturette that's designed to just cherry pick through chapters 13 and 15, pulling out very specific things and letting other things go, right? Which is always the hardest part about 13 and 15. Okay.